Well, Ben and Charlie, thank you so much for those kind and cordial and expansive words of introduction. I'm just delighted to be here tonight, and I'm delighted to participate in this terrific Boston College series, Writers Among Us. And certainly I'm glad to have the opportunity to share with you something of the issues that I've been thinking about and have really been absorbing me for about 15 years, and of course particularly to say something about, as Charlie said, this most recent book of mine on psychiatric medications. I also want to, at the outset, just express my appreciation for all the people who made tonight's event possible. I know the planning for this evening requires some collaboration among people in Dean Garza's office, at Boston College Magazine, and at the Boston College Bookstore, and so I thank you all for the work that you did. As my really, really good friend and great colleague, Charlie Derber, intimated in his introduction, I think of Is It Me or My Meds as the third book in a series of books that have a common goal. And the common goal is to understand the experience of mental illness from the perspective of patients themselves. I suppose anthropologists might say to understand the experience as though from behind the eyes of the people who are moving through it. And in the case of one of the books, to understand things from the position of family caregivers. As I thought about what might constitute a useful preface to discussing some of the themes in the book, it occurs to me to say that my writing, all of my writing, but particularly my writing in the last decade and a half, has been premised on a few very, very fundamental motifs. And I want to begin by mentioning just a couple of them. The first is about telling stories. I've, in some ways, come to view my work in really very simple terms. I'm a person who collects stories. I do in-depth interviews. I have lengthy conversations with people. I'd like to think of them as artful conversations with people. And in recent years, they have been stories of people whose lives have been disrupted, have been interrupted by mental illness, but most especially by depression. That's been the focus of my work. And then my task is to render those stories as faithfully as I possibly can, but always within the context of my thinking and my understanding and my theorizing as a social scientist, as a sociologist. And so in the case of Is It Me or My Meds, I did 50 interviews. Each of them runs typically about a couple of hours at least in length. And so you might well imagine that by the end of this process, I've compiled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of interview transcription. And as I see it, the craft, the art of the kind of qualitative analysis that I try to do is to live with that material, to become deeply intimate with those data, and consequently to discover underlying patterns, underlying themes, underlying dimensions that cut across individual accounts that at first might appear to be unique and thoroughly idiosyncratic. In some sense, the task is to see these patterns and at the same time in your writing to be respectful of the diversity of the accounts that you hear. The second and very much related motif, maybe inextricably connected to the first, is the idea of giving voice. And in fact, the first chapter of Is It Me or My Meds is entitled Giving Voice. I think that one of the most important mandates, one of the most important missions of my discipline, of sociology, is to give voice to the experiences of people whose voices and experiences would typically otherwise be blunted, marginalized, shifted off to the side, or simply ignored. I might just add biographically, and this goes now back several decades, that I was really captured by sociology as an undergraduate in college because I recognized as a college student, the impulse of sociologists to take the side of the underdog in society. And that just grabbed me. It just greatly appealed to me. And I think that sociologists are prone to argue, they're not the only ones, but they're certainly prone to argue, that if we want to understand how society works, if we want to understand, and I think that this is as good a definition of sociology as any, if we want to understand how social structures structure us, we need particularly to listen well to the narratives of those who are powerless, who are marginalized, who are disenfranchised, who are dispossessed, and unhappily, I have to say, still in 2006, in the case of mental illness, the narratives of those who occupy stigmatized statuses. There's just one other sort of addendum to these 2 points about stories and giving voice, and it's about the idea of expertise. With all due respect, and really truly with all due respect to the knowledge and the critically important work of a whole range of mental health practitioners, psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists, therapists of all sorts, I believe, along with the anthropologist and psychiatrist Arthur Kleinman, who's written a number of books, but I'm thinking now of his book called The Illness Narratives, that when it comes to any illness, in some respects, in some important respects, the real experts are the people who are moving through that experience. And I think that the best and the most effective healers recognize, respect, and rely on the expertise of their patients. And finally, to finish these preliminary remarks before saying something about is it me or my meds, let me provide, if I can, since I see a connection, just a very, very brief description of the first 2 books. I became interested in depression in about 1990. And my first book is a book called Speaking of Sadness. The subtitle is Depression, Disconnection, and the Meanings of Illness. Perhaps we might, in the question and answer, talk about that. I see America as a society that is increasingly disconnecting people from each other. Speaking of Sadness, like Is It Me or My Meds, is based on 50 lengthy conversations with people who had been diagnosed and were being treated for depression. And let me just say about the book that my concern in the book is not so much about questions of cause and cure. I do have some thoughts, certainly, about cause. I don't have the answers to those questions about cause and cure, and frankly, I don't think that anybody still has anything approaching definitive answers to those questions about depression. But my task in that book, the more manageable social psychological task, was with trying to understand how people with depression went about the business, the eminently social business, I would say, of trying to impose order and coherence and meaning and intelligibility onto a life circumstance which, when you are in the middle of it, hardly feels orderly, coherent, meaningful, or intelligible. It's a long story. Each of these books is a sort of a long story, but let me simply say that after Speaking of Sadness was published in 1996, I came to feel that the book had told a partial story, and at least another part of the story are the collective stories of caregivers, of the parents, the spouses, the siblings, the children, who are trying their best to honor a commitment to help somebody that they love without becoming engulfed by the other person's difficulty. And so I embarked on another enterprise. These things tend to be like 5-year deals. I did 60 interviews with family caregivers. And once again, in the interest of time, let me simply say that the larger sociological concern that I had in this book, in some sense, I see this book really as a book about obligations. I think that I'm asking in this book, the second book, no less a question than what do members of a family owe each other when somebody's in trouble? How do people draw the line? How do they draw the boundary line? And my respondents kept using that phrase about how do I draw the line? That was the conundrum for them. How do people create, you might say, a calculus of care? And again, you might not be terribly surprised that a social psychologist would be interested in how that boundary drawing is done differently by men and women, and how it's done differently by one's status in the family as a parent, a spouse, a sibling, or a child. Well, this brings me to, is it me or my meds? I thought, frankly, that in 2000, or maybe it was 2001, when The Burden of Sympathy was published, that I'd had my say about mental illness and that I would get on to other things. There were always other things to get on to. And here's what happened. In the summer of 2001, I decided, rather precipitously, I suppose, to get off my medications. I was diagnosed with depression in my early 30s, and like nearly anybody diagnosed with depression or any other mental illness, the moment of diagnosis thrust me into a new world, into a new culture, a confusing world. A world of psychiatrists, of therapists, of medications, lots of talk about faulty neurotransmitters and chemical imbalances in the brain. I've taken, over the years, a just bewildering array of medications over now 30 years, and I've always been really deeply ambivalent about their use and their efficacy. I'm certainly not one of those success stories that pharmaceutical companies like to talk about. And like most drug users, I often fiddle around with my medications. I often did experiments without telling my doctor because I felt in many ways that I was more of an expert than he was. I made, over the years, many half-hearted attempts to stop the medications, but this time, in the summer of 2001, it became my summer project. It became a determined and full-time project. And since I'm an ethnographer, to use a bit of a heavy word, I decided that I would keep field notes, to keep a journal of my experiences. And I called my journal Doxepin Diary, because one of the medications that I was taking at the time is an older so-called tricyclic antidepressant called Doxepin. And I should tell you that the prologue to this book, Is It Me or My Meds, is called Doxepin Diary. And what I try to do in Doxepin Diary is to tell something in about 8 or 10 pages about my experiences of that summer of 2001. I guess I have two fundamental goals in this prologue. One is that I really believe, and there's much debate about this in the social sciences, but for many social scientists, the idea that your self be somehow present in your work is just a sin, and you've got to do whatever you can to eradicate that contaminant. I just don't believe that. I agree with the sociologist Susan Krieger that you can't make an observation about the world without making an observation about yourself, and I'm very present in my writing. And I suppose that on some level, I wanted in the prologue to establish my credentials, if you will, as a person who could write about medications from the inside. Secondly, though, and more importantly, I didn't want to just spill my experience and my story out on the pages. I don't think that that serves much of an end. But rather, I wanted to tell those parts of the story that outline or suggest the kinds of key issues that I'm trying to, or want to, attend to throughout this book. And since tonight's event promises a reading, it's labeled a reading from this book, I'm a good boy and I do what I'm told. And so what I'd like to do is to read a shortened version of the prologue, Doxepin Diary. And it will give you some idea, and then I'd like to follow up on some of the key themes in the book that I think are suggested by this prologue. So Doxepin Diary goes something like this. The actual decision to get off antidepressants was made abruptly. I had not seen a psychiatrist for several months. I was overdue. Psychiatrists are ordinarily expected to meet with their drug-taking patients at least twice a year. A few hours before my appointment, I decided to tell my doctor I'll call him Bob. My brother's name is Bob. I don't know why I chose that. That I wanted to stop my medications. I'd seen Bob only twice. My previous psychiatrist could no longer see me, and I'd simply been assigned to Bob. I liked Bob, though, and I felt reasonably comfortable talking with him, even though his sensibilities did not seem to include my sociological angle of vision. Bob believed unambiguously in biology. Every time I tried to gain clarity on precisely why I felt I should stop the drugs, I got stuck. I now realize that I was driven as much by emotion as by any rational assessment of what would be a good course of action for a middle-aged man with a long history of depression and anxiety. I continue to ask myself these kinds of questions. Should I be so dependent on pills? Are drugs for diabetes really comparable to those for depression? Or is that just another tactic to pathologize bad feelings? Why am I not equally worried about the non-psychiatric drugs I take? The psychotropic medication shaped my identity. Then again, what's the big deal about taking a few pills each night? I've been doing it for so long now. Why shouldn't I just keep using them for the rest of my life? And yet, perhaps the drugs themselves are responsible for the many awful days and nights I've experienced over the years. There have been so many days when I felt, well, drugged. Tapering off doxepin and Klonopin was not fun. For the first few weeks I did pretty well, although I noticed an increase in my usual morning anxiety. It was nothing especially alarming. But when I finally reached 1/4 of my normal dose, I got very sick. My sleeping, always the barometer of my emotional well-being, eroded badly, and I documented this process in my doxepin diary. Thursday, June 7th, 12:20 in the afternoon. I just dragged myself out of bed. What a night. I'm sure I slept some after writing in this journal until 4:30 in the morning, but it was not the kind of sleep anyone would want. It certainly wasn't a dream of peace. When I did fall asleep, my fate was to dream vivid and disturbing dreams. I can't remember their content, but I do remember having several. They weren't precisely of the nightmare variety, but they felt distressing. Right now, I'm drinking a cup of coffee with the hope that the pressure on the top of my head will subside. It's unpredictable what becomes of the pressure during the day. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, it wears off the way that the morning fog over San Francisco Bay sometimes gives way to clarity and sun. On other days, the brain fog lingers all day, casting a mental pall over every activity. Throughout this time, I vacillated, often within minutes and throughout the days and nights, about the wisdom of my decision to stop taking medications. I could not distinguish the effects of stopping the drugs from a ferocious return of my mental illness. My resolve to complete the experiment was most severely tested and ultimately dissolved by social obligations, especially those involving travel and, quote, good times. The breaking point came in August. My daughter and her husband were preparing to leave for Senegal for 2 years on a project. My wife and I decided to spend a weekend with them in Las Vegas before their departure. After several nights of almost no sleep, I felt tormented by the journey, saved only by the fact that I could withdraw into the airplane seat and into myself. Once in Las Vegas, everyone wanted to go out on the town. I was frozen by fatigue, anxiety, and sadness, and simply could not face the lights, the movement, and the jangling sounds. I refused to leave the room. At that moment, I knew that my decision to stop the medication had failed, and I took some Klonopin. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The relief was enormous. Let me briefly bring you up to date on my awkward dance with medication. I discovered that stopping Klonopin was far more difficult than I had imagined. I had slowly tapered the dose over a period of 3 months, and after my relapse in Las Vegas, I made a full return to Klonopin. In fact, I now take twice the previous dose. Rather like the face-saving claims of the United States and Vietnam, I surrendered to the Klonopin while declaring victory. At least I was no longer taking doxepin. I've since learned that stopping benzodiazepines, like Klonopin, Valium, and Xanax, is no easy matter since patients often become habituated to these drugs. Even my partial victory, cutting down from 2 drugs to 1, was short-lived. At Bob's suggestion, I agreed to take trazodone, a drug that I'd taken unsuccessfully in the 1980s. Trazodone, he explained, is the antidepressant workhorse for sleep. It did help, but my sleeping was still unsound. And each time I met with Bob, he gently urged me to try an SSRI, for those of you who don't know, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the latest wonder drugs. He expressed confidence that Celexa would reduce my worry and improve my sleep. After a second opinion concurred with Bob's hopeful scenario, I decided to give it a try. Just as Bob predicted, things dramatically improved after a few weeks. I felt reborn and approached each day with an enthusiasm that I'd forgotten was possible. But after another few weeks, I began to have bad days and nights, and moreover, I learned that I was among the approximately 50% of patients whose sexuality is affected by SSRIs. Bob suggested adding Wellbutrin or even Ritalin to my cocktail of Celexa, Klonopin, and Trazodone. I was unwilling, though, to add drugs to fix a drug-induced problem. At this writing, in 2001 approximately, I am unsuccessfully experimenting with smaller doses of Celexa, and I'm strongly considering stopping it altogether. Since this time, I have been on at least 2 up and down. The process of going up and down is an interesting process all by itself, 2 other drugs. Like most of the people whose voices you will hear in this book, I am on an uncertain journey. It's easy to get horribly lost. There are no maps. You're driving on dimly lit and poorly marked roads that require constant guesses about which turns to take, unsettling detours of the norm. The trip is exhausting and you never quite know how far you've traveled. You hope to get to a healthy place, but you're not sure where it is, whether you will ever arrive, or even whether that destination exists for you. I hope it's clear from the title of this book, Is It Mere My Meds? And from what I've said so far, and as Charlie said at the beginning, that my core interest is with the connection between medication and identity, the connection between pills and personhood. At least I thought the title was clear and the cover was clear until I got recently a review on Amazon.com. Anybody can write a review of the book. And after a generally pretty complimentary review that I was happy to get, the person wrote this. She said, on a lighter note, the cover and title are somewhat misleading. If you haven't seen it, there it is. The cover is nice color, and it has these 2 happy pills, a happy pill and a sad pill, and so on. The cover and title are somewhat misleading. The librarian glanced at the title. She must have gotten the book at the library. And the little faces on the pills, and she said, oh, this book looks like it's going to be a riot. Happily, she set the record straight by ending with the thought that this book is more serious than the cover would indicate. I'd like for you to understand that my motive in writing Is It Mere My Meds is not to debunk psychiatry. It is not to resolve whether current biological theories of mental illness are correct or not. In fact, one of my quarrels with the literature on medications is that too much, I think, of the writing stems from a kind of false dichotomy. You've got people who are writing about these drugs and basically saying, to use that often used phrase, we ought to be sticking the stuff in the water. And on the other hand, you've got people like the radical psychiatrist Peter Bregan, who writes books with titles like Your Drugs Might Be Your Worst Problem and Toxic Psychiatry and so on. Frankly, I think that those kinds of dichotomies do an injustice to the real complexity of what these medications are all about. And to be sure, I'm pleased that so far the reviewers of this book have seen the work as balanced. I've been seen as neither anti nor pro medications, and that pleases me. And it's the way it's got to be because, once again, my aim is to simply tell the stories from the point of view of the people that I interviewed, and there are a multiplicity of stories. There are stories that are, to be sure, the dramatic success stories, but there are partial success stories, and there are stories of people who are resistant to drugs, that nothing does any good for them. There are stories of confusion and stories of hope and disillusionment, and yes, occasionally, horror stories. If I have an argument or if I have a thesis in this book, I don't usually think of myself as a person who has a thesis. I'm really interested in trying to understand a complicated situation. But if I do have a fundamental thesis in this book, it would be that all drugs, and I really draw from other sociologists in saying this, that all drugs, whether they are legal drugs or illegal drugs, require that people continuously justify their use and evaluate their consequences. People have got to continually engage in an interpretive process about what these drugs are doing to them and for them. They've got to continually be thinking about, why did I get on these things? Why am I staying on them? What do they do for me or to me? Who am I on these things? And so on. And so I would argue that all medications have implication for identity. It doesn't matter whether it's an aspirin, it doesn't matter whether it's vitamin pills, or whether it's psychiatric medications. At the same time, I would argue that some medications have more profound implications for people's identities than do others. And I think that what makes psychiatric medications interesting to me, in a conceptual sense, I mean, apart from the centrality of their place in my life, what makes them interesting to me conceptually, I think, is that unlike other medications, psychiatric drugs have as their purpose, they have as their goal, they have as their reason for being the transformation of people's moods, their feelings, and their perceptions. These are drugs that act on, I might even say, create people's consciousness, and by definition, therefore, I think they are drugs that have a profound effect on the essential nature of the identities of those who take them. When individuals begin a regimen of psychotherapeutic drugs, they do not just begin a revision of their biochemistry. They certainly begin a revision of their biochemistry. But equally, and more importantly, I think, almost, and something that I wish physicians better understood, is that taking these drugs begins an important revision in the essential nature of people's identities. And so, for example, a paradox that's raised by the words of many of my respondents is, how can it be that psychiatric medications can sometimes pretty dramatically relieve people's symptoms but make them feel worse about themselves? I don't want to overstay my time limit here, and so let me try for the remaining time that I have to just give you at least a thumbnail sketch of how I approach some of these issues in the chapters of this book. The second chapter of the book, after this chapter called Giving Voice, which really does what I'm doing here tonight, is called Unwelcome Careers. Here again, I've got to make reference to my buddy Charlie Derber, who says that, and he reminds me in all of our conversations, that all writers display what he calls mind prints. Themes that keep anchoring your thinking, anchoring your analysis, keep reappearing in all of your writing. And for me, one of those mind prints is the idea of career. I'm not the only sociologist that have used this notion. It's not just doctors and lawyers and bankers and college professors that pursue careers, but so also do ill people. And just as when people move from one moment or stage in a conventional career to another, there are corresponding shifts in their identity, well, then that's equally true of people who follow illness careers and take medications. And so I'm really interested in process over time. I'm interested in how identities unfold over time. It is a processual thing. And what I try to do in this chapter, actually, is to tell three complete stories. One of the things I always feel awkward about in my writing, with this kind of writing, is that usually your analysis is based on snippets of people's conversation, and there's a real danger in decontextualizing people's stories. And so I'm always looking for places in my writing to tell more complete stories. And so in this chapter, I tell three archetypal stories that I think represent the three most common experiences with psychiatric drugs. My third chapter is called Married to Medication. And maybe, as time allows, you might want to quiz me as to whether it's reasonable to make any kind of analogies between becoming committed to psychiatric medications and how we become committed in our normal human relations. I actually got partly the idea for this by reading a master's thesis of one of our students on 20-something people by Abigail Brooks and the difficulties of generating personal relationships. In a way, the idea of this chapter, the central message of this chapter, was reflected in a fortune cookie I got in a restaurant after a meal. And the fortune read, maybe it was Confucius that said this, I don't know. A temporary relationship will become permanent. A temporary relationship will become permanent. This chapter is a chapter about commitment. And what I discover in talking to people is that often people begin taking psychiatric medications with great resistance. And then they follow a path that leads, some people of course stop, but many people, and most of those that I interviewed, follow a path, a process that sometimes can last for 20 years, where they finally conclude, and I can't tell you how many times I heard these words, I guess I'll be taking these drugs for the rest of my life. And I would add, with the marriage thing, until death do us part. And so my question for this chapter is, how is it that people become committed to a biomedical version of the world? Or maybe equally, how is it that people ultimately capitulate to a biomedical version of the world? What does it mean to embrace that view of the world? And what are the consequences of embracing a biomedical disease model for your identity? I think it's fitting that at the very center of this book that there be a chapter on authenticity. And my fourth chapter is called Searching for Authenticity. The question of authenticity is a big one these days. You can't pick up the newspaper without reading about people like Barry Bonds and steroids and what records really mean. Same student, Abigail Brooks, is now writing a thesis on plastic surgery and the questions that that raises and what it means about questions about authenticity of self. And Charlie, I keep mentioning you over and over again, but we're talking about an article in the Globe the other day about people doping themselves for all kinds of things to perform better in work. And I know that students use Ritalin when it's not been prescribed for them in order to enhance their ability to study for an exam, I imagine the night before the exam. And so what I really am trying to do is to, and I think that the core issue in this book really is about questions of authenticity of self. And in this chapter, I raise three very fundamental questions. The first question is, what does it mean to cross certain identity boundaries? And really what I have in mind with that question is, what are the implications for people for beginning to take psychiatric medications? And I think the implication is that it means having to move from the status of thinking of yourself as a merely troubled person to the status of a mentally ill person. That's where the resistance certainly comes in, a resistance that's typically overcome by desperation. The second question, and the one that I think I find the most intriguing, and I wish that social psychologists would attend to it even more, is the question of what does it mean to feel like yourself? In some large measure, we are what we feel. And sometimes, even bad feelings are ones that we want to own. I'll get back to that in a second. But the third question, I think, is the one that I was asking in 2001. The question is, where do I locate, this is kind of an Irving Goffman question for those of you who study sociology, where do I locate my true self? Where do I locate my essential self? I mean, I think that part of my thinking in 2001 is I'm not the same person at that time at age 57 as I was at age 31 when I began these things. All of our lives change. My work was different, my family was different. There was a longing, I think we all have a longing to know who we really are. And I think taking these drugs over a long period of time creates all kinds of causal confusions for people. Is it me or my meds? the question about feelings and authenticity is a really interesting one. I spoke with a doctor, a middle-aged guy, who told me that after he started taking Prozac, he said, "I got my eyes back." I said, "What do you mean you got your eyes back?" He said, "Well, I think now that I'm better able to tell people what I really feel." And then he said, "But here's the problem. The other day, I was listening to a song on the radio. It reminded me of my mother, who had just recently died. I don't know the song, but I think the song was titled Lightly Like a Rose." He said, "I wanted to cry for my mother, and I couldn't cry, and I think it was the Prozac that made it impossible for me to cry." The drugs, he felt, and I believe it's true, work by narrowing the band of feelings that people can have. I can't give you lots of examples, the book is filled with examples, but I spoke with a 22-year-old guy who, like most 22-year-old people, is experimenting and trying to understand more about his own intimacies. And his girlfriend wanted to know whether he loved her or not. And in the interview, he told me that he couldn't give her the answer. He didn't know. He felt like he couldn't give the answer. He felt like that the feeling was not accessible to him. And at one point in our interview, he said that when he took the medication every morning, it was rather like putting on a life vest that allowed him to bob around in the ocean all day, but he never really took off. And then he said at the end, rather plaintively, "I've lost my identity." In some ways, I think that the most sociologically informed chapter, in a way, in this book is Chapter 5, which is called Significant Others. And my take in this chapter is that pill-taking is a social act. We might take pills alone, and we might take pills in private. But to the extent, as sociologists have always argued, that ourselves are fashioned through our interactions with other people, ourselves arise out of interaction with other people, then drug taking has got to be understood as a social act rather than merely as a private decision. And throughout my conversations about medications are countless references to significant others, what a parent feels about whether you should be taking drugs or not, how taking medications affects your relationship with your spouse, what to do when you start a new relationship about your medicine cabinet, whether to confide in friends, whether to open up to coworkers, and very importantly, how healers are responding, the meanings that they are giving to things. And so in this 5th chapter, I examine how interviewees' relationships with doctors, with friends, with family members, and intimates shape their drug-taking careers, the meaning that they give to drugs, and I would add, and yet again, I imagine there are physicians who understand this, but I wish there were more, the way in which the meanings that you give to the drugs even affect whether or not they work. My editor at Harvard, from the very outset, pushed very hard that there had to be a chapter on kids, teenagers in this book. It was methodologically daunting to talk to kids, and I got dissed a lot. I would drive to like Worcester for an hour, and then the kid would like go to the mall or something. If mentally ill, they also thought that my lack of knowledge about popular culture was pretty humorous. But if mentally ill adults rarely get to speak candidly about the meanings attached to psychotropic drugs, then children's voices are even more muted and more marginalized. I think it's in the last chapter of this book that I cite a statistic that to me is an astounding statistic. And it is that between 1987 and 1996, a 10-year period, the number of children using psychiatric drugs in the United States has tripled. This is, I think, truly an astonishing statistic. What I learned, or in some sense, what this chapter on teenagers, the root basis for the analysis is once again the cornerstone of social psychology, which is that you can't understand the meanings, you can't understand people's behaviors, their attitudes, their feelings, apart from their lived worlds. And as I started to talk with these admittedly small number of kids, 10 kids, it became so perfectly clear that the meaning that they give to medications and to diagnoses and to psychiatrists and to therapy and all the stuff that's associated with it just simply can't be separated from their life in middle school and in high school. And I must say that these 10 stories that I collected for this chapter left me with the sense that today's teenagers experience a more profound powerlessness, alienation from adult authority, and competition for respect than ever before. I got a bit of a belly sense listening to them about how torturous a place school can be for an emotionally troubled teenager who doesn't fit in. And so maybe the sociological kind of summary to this chapter is that behaviors of teenagers, like rejecting taking medications and not going to therapists and so forth, that seem from the point of view of adults to be the vagaries of adolescence or just the irrational behavior of teenagers or hormones gone haywire. That when, in fact, you look at these decisions from within the context of the worlds in which they're living and what it means to embrace a certain kind of reality, identity, same thing, then it becomes more clearly understandable and, in fact, a rational act on the part of what these kids are doing. And finally, my last chapter is called High on Drugs. And if you do want to, as Ben said, read a version of this, it's excerpted in the last issue of Boston College Magazine. I always feel that after I've spent most of my time in a book sticking pretty closely to the data, that I've sort of earned the right in a last chapter to speculate more broadly, to think about things more broadly. And if my concern throughout this book is on the relationship between medications and personal identity, then my concern in this last chapter shifts because it's really more about the connection between drugs and our collective cultural identity. I'm not the only person to say this, but I think that one of the most important transformations, maybe I could even say revolutions, that's happened in America in the last 20 years particularly, is the triumph of what some people call biological psychiatry. More specifically, since about 1980, psychiatry has increasingly embraced a biomedical model of disease for explaining and treating, I got to say, just a bewilderingly increased array of human behaviors that are thought to be somehow or other inappropriate and warrant and require the intervention of medicine to treat. I'm really, really concerned in this chapter about the line between normal pain and pathological pain and how that line gets drawn and what the implications are for increasingly treating people with medicines for what Buddhists would think of as sort of normal life pain. The paradigm in psychiatry has shifted dramatically, and to borrow from an anthropologist by the name of Tanya Luhrmann, who wrote a book called Of Two Minds, which is about the way that psychiatrists are trained. The way she puts it is that the shift has been from disorders of the mind to diseases of the brain. This might not sound like much more than a semantic shift, but I'm trying to show in this chapter that this kind of paradigm shift has extraordinary consequences for the way that we think about ourselves, for the way that we conceptualize human pain, and for the way that culture itself is evolving. And if you'll allow me, I'm sure you're ready for this, a last word. I'm often asked, I was first asked by my daughter this question years ago. What's a sociologist doing studying such obviously medical, biological, or psychological matters as depression, drug taking, and so on? I hope it's clear from my brief remarks tonight that if we want to understand the pandemic of affective disorders in America, if we want to understand the absolute explosion in the use of medications of all sorts in America, really, then we need to spend at least as much time thinking about cultural chemistry as we currently do about brain chemistry. Throughout my career, I have always found inspiration in the words of Charles Wright Mills, who's an iconic figure in sociology. There's no sociology major that should leave Boston College without reading Mills's 1959 book, The Sociological Imagination. And in that book, he cogently argues that the sociological imagination demands And I quote Mills, and let's forgive him for using the word man. He was the product of his own historical period. But the sociological imagination demands that we grasp the interplay of man and society, of biography and history, of self and world, the interplay of man and society, of biography and history, of self and world. In other words, a sociological angle of vision sees a connection between the character of culture and even our innermost thoughts and feelings, including, of course, the deeply troubling thoughts and feelings that we label as depression. I certainly hope that my colleagues feel in reading my work that it displays some of that vision and some of that imagination. I naturally hope that my comments have helped you to understand what I've been up to and raise at least a few questions for your continuing reflection. I thank you very, very much. Ben tells me that if you want to stick around, I'm certainly glad to stick around for 15 minutes or so of questions, if people have them. The first one's always the toughest.
I was just wondering, there's a lot of beginning counselors in the audience actually tonight, and I know that's not the focus of your book or your talk, but I didn't know if you could maybe say a little bit about what counselors and clinicians might, how we can use the knowledge in your book to work with people. Any advice you might have?
Well, one of the things that saddens me, actually, is that the conventional wisdom which I believe is that the most effective treatments to help people is a combination. I mean, I'm not against drugs. That it is a combination of drugs and therapy. Unfortunately, I think what's happened, partly because of economic contingencies, is it's a lot cheaper to give people pills, and the therapy thing has fallen a little bit through the cracks. And I just think that people, honestly, and this comes not so much from some deep scientific understanding of things. I just think that people need to be heard. I mean, invariably, at the end of interviews, people would thank me for interviewing them, and they'd say, it's just so liberating to have the chance to tell my story, to be heard, you know? And I think that the role of clinicians, which again, I don't want to put all medical people in the same bag, that's unfair. And partly it's when you talk to medical people, I can only spend 8 minutes with a patient because I have to see 26 patients a day or something like that. I mean, partly I think they'd like to listen but can't, And I think that hopefully we will sometime come around to the idea that we should be, in some sense, going backwards. I mean, we should be going a little bit back to where we were, where therapy, I think, had a much more full place in the way that people were treated. And I just think that being able to listen, being able to help people to navigate through really complicated moments in their life is just a critically important job for you to do. And there's no question that you should stick with it and be proud of the place that it has. I don't know if that helps you, but.
I just wanted to know how you came into contact with the people that you interviewed and how you located them, and if you had some kind of criteria for who you chose.
Yeah. Have you taken sociology methodology courses or something? For many, many years, I've had an association with an organization called MDDA. It's the Manic, Depressive, and Depressive Association. It's kind of like Groucho Marx said, would you want to belong to a club that had a name like that, I suppose. But it's an organization that saves lives, really, and it meets at McLean's Hospital on Wednesday nights, every Wednesday night. It's hugely successful. A couple hundred people show up. And once again, it's this matter of talking. It's like when you talk to people who know that you live in the same country as they do, so to speak. It carries, a different meaning in that sense. In all of my work, this group has been enormously helpful to me, and I've often begun by doing interviews, first of all, by just simply listening in those groups. I mean, I don't embark on a project until I sit and listen for months to how people talk about these things, you know. And so I initially get many of the interviewees from that group. At the same time, there is a real danger that you can get caught into one network, and that can create problems in terms of generalizability. And so I've done a range of things. When it comes to drug taking, it's not hard to just mention to a few friends, I'm looking for people that, you know, are using psychiatric drugs. I mean, well, like, wow, there aren't, you know, there's no big trouble finding people for that, you know. And people come banging down your door to talk about that sort of thing. I've put advertisements in newspapers. I've relied on therapist friends to talk up my work and send people to me. One of the issues that maybe you're hinting at a little bit is what kind of generalizations can you make from only 50 interviews? And that's an important question. It's one I think about a lot. And I think that in the end, the ultimate test of the validity of your work, I'm really glad to give up breadth for depth is what I'm doing. And I think that the ultimate test for validity is that when people read your stuff who know the situation, they say, yeah, this guy's caught it, he's got it, he understands. The analysis makes sense. So it's really from a variety of sources but the main thing I think is to try to get a sample that is balanced in terms of some strategic variables like men and women and age and that sort of thing. I mean, you're strategically looking to do that, and also not to get caught into one network so that you've got a kind of very homogeneous sample of people.
At the beginning of your talk, you referred to your second book, I believe, where you talked about boundaries that you need to set up trying to help loved ones with depression. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that part?
Yeah. This is a tremendously difficult problem for people caring for other people, and I imagine it's got to be a problem for those of you who are students who might have roommates that are in trouble or any of a variety of situations. And as I said at the beginning, the puzzle for people, the conundrum, is that you want to help, but you don't want to somehow get drawn in a way that is going to be hurtful to yourself. And I have to tell you that of the 60 people that I interviewed for The Burden of Sympathy, the second book, a good number of them, maybe the majority of them, I could have interviewed for Speaking of Sadness. I somewhere in Speaking of Sadness say that depression is a contagious illness. I don't mean it's contagious in the sense that a cold is contagious, but it's contagious in the sense that, you know, it's really hard you can become ill by trying to help somebody, and it's not an easy thing. This is not my answer, but Speaking of Sadness is a chapter called The 4 C's. And one of the almost mantras that you hear on Wednesday nights at this McLean's group in the parents, family and friends group is they say, I didn't cause it, I can't cure it. All I can do is cope with it. I've said 3 of them, there's a 4th one. Cause, cope, cure, there's a 4th one. But the idea is that you've got to somehow, they also say things like, you know, if a plane is in trouble and you've got a child with you and the air mask comes down, you don't put it on the kid first, you put it on yourself. You can't help anybody else unless you're, you know, sort of in good shape yourself. And so I don't have the answer to the question, and in fact the whole book is about how people grapple with that question. And it gets all caught up with, you know, moral kinds of things. I mean, I have people in the book who admitted to me that I sometimes hate my kid. And when I would say to them, well, you know, I hear that from a lot of people, they thought it was idiosyncratically them who had these negative emotions towards people. And then when they had these negative feelings, then they had a second order of emotions. They felt bad about the negative emotions, you know. And so I think that what really the book is about, and I think one of the reasons that my books don't sell so well is I don't have answers, you know. It's like I don't have like the 7 steps to like cure the problem. It's like. And so I think that's what people are trying to do. They're trying continuously to negotiate that line. And part of the dilemma that they face is that it's like the line, that famous line in the sand, you know, that wherever you draw the line, to complete the metaphor here, the gusty and unpredictable winds of mental illness come and blow the line away, and the line has to be redrawn and redrawn and redrawn and redrawn. And the whole relationship between helper or caregiver and ill person becomes a kind of an ongoing construction project in line drawing. And so I'm afraid to say that it remains a puzzle, but the people who do the best ultimately realize that in the end they can show support, but if they are drawn in too much, I mean, there's this whole literature on enabling also and what that's all about, but it's looking for that boundary that is really difficult.
David, I'm trying to understand better what you're saying about the relationship between medication and one's identity. And I've heard you say several things about identity, which for me fall into two different categories, self versus sense of self. And I want to know, and to me they're a little different, they might have different implications for what you're saying.
Yeah, well, Michael, you know, I'm going to do what professors do. Maybe you better tell me the distinction you're thinking about here.
Well, and it is this, it is that the drugs may affect your, when you gave examples, for example, limited variation in your affective responses.
Yeah.
That's yourself,
Mhm.
the way you see the world.
Mhm.
There is separate from that, I'm now a different, the awareness that I'm now a different person, I'm taking these drugs. That's who I am.
Yeah.
The way someone might also say that they went on insulin.
Yeah.
Or if they dropped pre-med, or if they
Yeah.
were New Englander all their life and moved to, got to do Texas or something.
Yeah.
And that those are very different mechanisms, and I'm asking which of those.
I don't think it's which, Mike. I think both are happening. I think it is, on the one hand, the immediacy of I'm not feeling things that I used to feel, but also connected with that is sometimes the feeling people saying things like, you know, I may not like depression. Depression is an awful feeling, but my sense of humor, my sense of irony, the way I understand the world, my insight, my creativity comes from depression. And in the end, I mean, one of the books I'm very fond of is a book by a woman named Slater, who wrote a book called Prozac Diary. And at first, Prozac had like this almost religious-like miracle for her, but she was a writer, you know, and she found herself like spending her days taking long hot baths and redecorating her apartment and stuff like that, and she had lost the energy, the anxiety-driven urge to write had sort of been lost, and so for her, it was a big question about whether to leave the drug behind, because you know she had lost that. And so, I mean, I think that part of it is that people will say, the first part of the thing is that I've lost certain feelings that are not sort of really who I am, but nevertheless bother me that I don't have them. On the other hand, there are people who will say, you know, I feel in taking these medications that I have a tainted identity. I have a tainted self. Something more fundamental about me has changed. So maybe it's an easy answer, but if I understand your distinction, I think both are operating.
It's a non-technical distinction, it's just the basis of what you said. And I guess why that distinction would be important if it were that it would involve different mechanisms and trying to understand each of those would involve a different way of understanding, a different approach to understanding.
Yeah, I agree with that. Sorry. Oh.
I have several questions for you, but I was
Oh.
wondering if you could just further.
We did say 15 minutes, and my bedtime, I got to take my pills at about 9:15, so.
I was wondering if you could further comment on labeling of mental illness and particularly the DSM classification system from a cultural perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the labeling thing and the stigma, I began by saying something about telling the stories of underdogs and the dispossessed and the marginalized and all that stuff. And as much as people like Mike Wallace and other famous people get on television and talk about their depression, the reality is I'm lucky. I'm really lucky because I live an occupational life where I can admit to my colleagues that I suffer from depression, but I produce things that are valuable around here, so it's less of a problem, you know. But I think the stigma is extremely real. If you really want to get partly a sense of this, there's a really interesting book that I use in a course that I teach on mental health and illness called Media Madness that traces sort of the stigma and how mental illness is portrayed in movies and on television and all that stuff. And People are really afraid of mentally ill people, and they think they're more violent than other people, and this is just all wrong-headed. It's just not correct. And I just think that there is all kinds of labeling, and I think that people at their risk let other people know that they're suffering from this, because it does have real implications for their friendships. It has real implications for work. It has real implications for, just all kinds of things. And I hope that we're becoming more enlightened, and I think that there has certainly been some change and some shift, but I'm still not sanguine about the degree to which mental illness does not figure into the same category as other illnesses, both in terms of treatment, the money that's spent on it, all the rest. It just is different. I don't know if, again, I never know whether I'm quite responding to your question.
I think that's all the response maybe we got time for.
Okay, I'll take one more. This person wearing a hat there.
Hi. You spoke a little bit about children going on medications and how you should always question if your medication's like working or what's that doing to your identity. I've been on medication since the 6th grade, so I've always had a hard time like wondering, like, is this me or not?
Is it you? Is it me or my meds? Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, that's,
But how do you go about versus like starting in later life where you already have some sense of your identity, kind of dealing with children who've been on it for more than half their
I
life?
think that this is a really, really huge problem. And I think it's a huge problem because so much of people's identities are established. Any developmental psychologist would talk about this. And let me maybe answer the question kind of with an anecdote, because it's really a sense about the trouble that I have with this medicating young people. One of the persons that I interviewed, and I have a rather lengthy quote from her, I think, maybe in that chapter on teens, is a young woman who started taking medications, often having the pills pushed on them by adults, and that's another part of the story, and sort of the powerlessness of kids to say no in the face of it, and so on and so forth. And she told me that for a long period of time, when she got to be, I don't know what age, 13, 14 years old, she worried about herself a lot, and when her friends were talking about, oh, that little kid, that boy, isn't he cute, and all that stuff, she didn't have those feelings. And she started wondering about her sexuality. She started wondering about maybe she's gay. She did worry about that a lot in a world that is not kind also to gay people. And then finally, at age 16, she gets into a doctor's office. She'd been taking, I can't remember which of the SSRIs it was, but maybe Zoloft. And finally, for the first time at age 16, the doctor says, well, one of the side effects of Zoloft is that it blunts your libido. She felt that she was robbed of a whole moment of development in her life, and the very least that adults can do is to be upfront and honest with kids about these medications and what they do and so forth. I mean, I talk with lots of kids where to get the kid to take the medication, the parents would not use the word antidepressant. They'd say, I'm going to give you an anti-stress medication. You're under a little bit of stress. This will help you. And so partly I think it's really dangerous. I mean, again, there are kids who need this stuff without question, And for me, the puzzle always is, how do we start thinking better about where to draw the line between those who absolutely need the help and need to try these things, and those where it becomes sort of gratuitous that you're giving them the medications. And I guess the best answer that I can really give is that it's a vote for honesty, that doctors being honest and parents being honest and not withholding information from kids because they feel that they can't somehow deal with that information. Okay.
There was a line of yours I found especially striking, which you said that the line between normal and pathological pain has become blurred. I was wondering if in any of your interviews you've come across a sense that patients have had a sense that that line has become blurred.
Well, yeah, because people are confused about whether what they're experiencing is something that should be treated by medicine. I mean, the constant ongoing question is that I think many of us, now look, when I'm not talking, there are instances where depression so flattens you. I mean, there are degrees of this, like any other illness. I mean, when depression puts you in a situation where you can't move, where you can't get out of bed in the morning, where you can't take a shower, you know, there's not much doubt there that you got to do something about that. That kind of pain, that level of pain requires intervention, and I'm all for, all for that. It saves lives. But I think what's happening, and really what this last chapter is about, is that it's becoming increasingly confusing for lots of people because they keep getting told all over the place. You turn on the television, I don't know why the cycle of advertising works the way it does, but there was a period of time where you couldn't go for 15 minutes without seeing a Zoloft advertisement on TV, you know? I mean, this direct-to-consumer advertising business. We keep getting the message in America that anything short of complete happiness is a kind of a pathology. And if you're not completely happy, then you better do something about it. And the doctors have the tools to make you happy. And I don't know where the line between sort of the normal pain of living, the vicissitudes of living leaves off, but what I do think is a project for social scientists is to recognize that where we draw that line, and I think we keep drawing it towards including more and more things that years ago nobody would ever have considered to be a disease. I mean, I was listening to the radio about 3 or 4 months ago, and there was a psychiatrist on with the DSM thing, and he was seriously talking about wanting to get a new diagnosis into the DSM. This was his, mission. And the new diagnosis was, they're always letters, okay? Like, it's EBD. You suffer from EBD. And EBD was extreme bias disorder. And the people who, and he talked about Uncle George, who has racist attitudes, you know, to the point where Uncle George doesn't get along real well with his family, and that's sort of dysfunctional. And let's get Uncle George is racist, you know. And so my quarrel with psychiatry is that more and more things like that keep getting included, that the cultural line keeps moving, and it confuses people. It confuses people about what to do about their own pain. And I think what we need to think about, and what I'm trying to think about, is the idea that where that line gets drawn is a political process, and it's a cultural process. It's not just a scientific process, and let's stop playing around with that idea that it's just a matter of good science. Does that help a little?
Thank you, David.
Okay.